The wind had no reason to be kind that day. It whispered through the bones of the house like it was telling secrets to the dead. The windows had long since given up holding back the world, and the door swung on one hinge, creaking like it mourned someone it used to know. She lay in the back room, if you could call it a room, just four walls barely standing, with a bed frame too rusted to protest under her weight. Her breath came in shallow pulls, not from fear, but from the weight of what had been taken. Her lips were cracked, her hands curled like old leaves. The dress that clung to her had once been white. Now it was stained with dust, dried blood, and the forgotten hours of too many nights. They had promised her warmth. They told her she'd be taken somewhere quiet to give birth, away from town, where no one would ask questions. The rich woman's eyes had glinted with false mercy, her gloved hand brushing a coin across the midwife's palm like she was buying silence, not care. Then the wagon turned toward the edge of nowhere. She remembered the way the man, her employer, avoided her eyes. She remembered his voice when he said, "Leave her. We paid." And then he walked out, boots crunching over dead prairie grass. That was 3 days ago. Or 4. Time doesn't pass the same when you're dying. She had screamed once on the first night. Not from the pain, that was familiar, but from the loneliness. She hoped someone might hear. The coyotes, maybe. Or God. But no one came, and her voice broke. So now she waited. Not for rescue. Just for quiet. The house had once belonged to an old trapper, long dead. His boots were still by the hearth, gathering spiders. The hearth was empty. The chimney clogged. Cold air moved through her skin like it owned her. Her belly was full with the child, her child, the one that shouldn't have been. Not by society's eyes. She had been the help, the unseen, until the man of the house saw her in the hallway one evening and decided she would be his. Then he called her wicked. Then he let his wife handle the shame. A gust blew through the window. The wind had teeth tonight. She turned her face toward the open door. Her eyes were wide but dry. She wasn't praying. She had stopped doing that after the third contraction and the second hallucination. There was no point in begging the sky. But something moved, far off, like a horse's breath. Low, measured, coming closer. She didn't lift her head, couldn't. But her fingers twitched, a protest from somewhere deeper than fear. The sound grew louder. Hoofbeats now. Then silence. Then boots. Not the careless stomp of a settler. Not the polished gait of a preacher. This tread was slow, heavy, like someone carrying more than weapons. The door creaked, as if remembering how to open. She closed her eyes. A shadow entered. He didn't speak. Not at first. Just stood in the threshold like he was weighing the room's sorrow. Then he stepped inside. Quiet as dusk. He was tall, wrapped in worn buffalo hide, his dark braids threaded with beads that caught the firelight from the tiny flame he cupped in his hand. He knelt without asking. His eyes scanned her, not with hunger, not with judgment. Just a warrior's stillness, the kind that sees what others refuse to look at. He touched her wrist, then her forehead. His hand was calloused but warm. She mumbled something, not a word, just a breath in the shape of one. His mouth didn't move, but he reached into his satchel and pulled out a pouch of herbs, pressed to her lips with fingers that smelled like pine and river water. She drank because she had nothing left to resist. His name meant nothing to her. She didn't know he had once stood in battle, or that he had lost brothers to the same town that had paid to discard her. She didn't know he'd left his people for reasons no one dared ask. All she knew was that he was real. She drifted again. Sleep came in short, uneven waves. She thought she heard him speaking to the fire in a language made of earth and memory. She thought she felt something soft being draped over her, like the sky had chosen her for once. She dreamed of smoke, of feathers, of standing knee-deep in a river while something watched her from the trees. Outside, the storm gathered. Snow began to fall, slow at first, then in sheets. The land went white, silent. The warrior did not sleep. He moved through the house, mending broken boards, sweeping aside the rat droppings, tucking rags into gaps where the wind howled through. Not for comfort, for dignity. He found a can of lard and a cracked tin of beans. He did both. When he returned to her side, she was curled inward, one arm over her belly, as if shielding her child from the memory of men. He sat beside her and placed a hand near her shoulder, not touching, just near. And in the glow of the fire, as snow coated the windows, she opened her eyes again. Only for a moment. She did not ask him who he was. She simply whispered, "Why?" And though he could have said nothing, could have shrugged like so many do, he answered in the low hush of dusk meeting dawn, because no one else did. And he stayed. The storm had come in the night and covered the world in white forgiveness. Snow hushed the land like a mother calming a weeping child. The house, once stripped of warmth and purpose, now held the breath of two souls, one nearly gone, the other steady as stone. He moved like someone who belonged to silence. The Cheyenne did not look at her like she was weak. He didn't scold her for surviving, didn't soften his tone as if afraid she might break. He treated her like the land, worn but sacred. And she, in turn, gave him nothing but the truth of her breathing. No thanks, no pleading. That morning, her eyes fluttered open just as he was feeding the fire. Her stomach cramped beneath the thin blanket, a dull ache spreading like spilled ink. She turned her head toward him, watched. He didn't speak, but his gaze met hers, held steady. It was not the look of a savior. It was the look of a man who had seen hunger, grief, and too many promises rot before they bloomed. She wondered, in that hazy ache, if he'd lost someone once, someone who wore their quiet like she did. He stirred something into a bowl of warm water and brought it to her lips. His other hand gently cradled the back of her head, lifting her just enough to drink. The mixture tasted like soil and bitter leaves, but her throat stopped burning, and her thoughts came clearer. There was a question in her eyes. He saw it, but he didn't answer. Instead, he set the bowl down, adjusted the blanket across her legs, and sat against the wall, close, but not crowding. He watched the snow fall through the window, crack like it was speaking to him. She lay still for a while, tracing the lines of his face with her thoughts. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes that seemed both ancient and unafraid. His presence was not loud. It was weight, like a tree that had stood through fire and wind but still shaded the ground. When she finally spoke, her voice came out rough. "You should go. They'll come back." He didn't blink. His hands were resting on his knees, open. "Let them," he said. She closed her eyes. Not from trust, not yet, but from exhaustion. Her body trembled beneath the blanket. Not cold, just hollow. A shell that still remembered warmth, but hadn't felt it in a long while. The child inside her shifted. She winced. He noticed. She wanted to explain. The man, the house, the shame handed to her like laundry to fold. But no words came. She had told that story once before to someone who didn't care. She wasn't ready to risk the telling again. Instead, she listened to the small sounds, the crack of firewood, the distant cry of a hawk, his slow, even breath. He rose only to tend the fire or stir more herbs. Once he found a pail near the back door, carried it through the snow, and returned with melted snow water, cupped in a cast-iron pot. Steam rose from the hearth as he warmed it. She watched him move. There was no rush, no waste. Every motion had purpose. She'd never seen a man who did so much without speaking. He reminded her of the old stories her mother whispered before the world taught them both to hush. Stories of people who spoke to the land, who listened more than they commanded. Men who loved by watching your pain until it wasn't heavy anymore. He turned once and caught her staring. She didn't look away. He studied her in return, not rudely, just long enough to see her clearly. Then he nodded, as if they'd made a pact without words. Later, she tried to sit up. Her strength buckled. He reached for her elbow, firm and gentle. No shame passed between them. No fuss. She leaned against the wall, eyes half-lidded, breath uneven. Her hair clung to her skin. She hadn't bathed in days. She hadn't even thought to care. But when he offered her a damp cloth and turned his back to give her privacy, something inside her cracked, not from weakness, but from the unfamiliar shape of respect. He left the room then, stepping into the snow-bright world beyond the cabin. Through the open door, she saw him walk to the trees, kneel, and place something small in the snow, a feather, maybe, or a stone. A gesture of offering. She felt a heat rise in her chest that had nothing to do with illness. When he returned, dusk was stretching long fingers across the prairie. He brought with him kindling, wild herbs, and something wrapped in hide. He set it near the fire. The smell that followed, cooked rabbit, roasted quiet and slow, made her throat tighten. He sat near her, unwrapped the food, and placed a portion in a tin bowl. He waited. She took it with both hands, shaky, ate in silence. The food was plain, but it settled into her like forgiveness. After, he added fresh wood to the fire, then lit a second flame near the broken window. The shadows danced soft on the walls, and the snow kept falling. She turned her face toward him. "You don't even know me." He looked up. His voice, when it came, was so low it almost sounded like the wind again. "I don't need to." She let that sit between them. And for the first time in days, maybe weeks, she felt something gentle beneath her ribs. Not hope, not yet, but the soft ache of being seen without being measured. That night he didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, carving something small from a strip of bone. A charm, perhaps. Something to hang or offer. She watched his hands move, the way he smoothed each edge with care. She drifted to sleep slowly, wrapped in warmth not just from the fire, but from the knowledge that someone was watching who meant her no harm. And just before sleep took her, she heard the wind pause, as if the world, too, was holding its breath, wondering what came next. The house no longer felt like a place death had claimed. The air still held its cold, but it no longer bit. The wind still pushed against the walls, but the cracks had been stuffed with cloth, moss, patience. And in the kitchen corner, a small kettle hissed softly on the iron stove, its breath curling upward like a voice learning how to speak. She sat near the fire now, not upright, not strong, but present. Her back rested against a pile of folded blankets. One arm curved protectively around her stomach, the other balanced a warm bowl in her lap. Her fingers trembled only slightly as she brought the broth to her mouth. Across from her, the warrior added more snow to a pot. It hissed, spit, and settled into boil. There were no words between them yet. Not many, anyway. Just glances passed like letters neither dared to sign. Just the rhythm of boiling water and shared silence. He had given her space, not distance, but dignity. Enough to feel the shape of herself again. Enough to notice the way her breath had become steadier, the way her child stirred inside her with the slow assurance of life refusing to be quieted. She caught him watching her once. Not staring. Watching. The way someone studies the horizon before a storm, not out of fear, but out of reverence. She asked his name that morning. Her voice barely cleared the rasp in her throat. He answered, eventually, but not with a sound she could keep. It wasn't for her tongue, just for her ears. And even that he said only once. She nodded. Said hers too. Just her first name. Her last name had been given by a man who never truly gave her anything. That was enough. Later, when she tried to stand on her own, he moved without a word and took her elbow gently. She didn't fight it. There was no pride left to protect, only the humbling grace of being allowed to live again. Outside, the snow had slowed. Pale sunlight shimmered through icicles that clung to the windows like frozen prayers. Birds were quiet. Even the crows had flown elsewhere, perhaps sensing that this cabin was no longer a place for scavengers. Inside, he handed her a cup, warm, wood-handled, simple. She drank slowly. It tasted like boiled pine needles and something bitter. Healing came in many strange flavors. She asked, after a long pause, "How did you know I was here?" He didn't look up from the bundle he was mending. "Didn't," he said. "Just passing through." She held that answer in her chest, like a coal, warm and weightless. When he finally did meet her gaze, it wasn't with apology. There was nothing unsure in his eyes, just a grounded certainty, like a man who had never asked the world for much, but always noticed its smallest details. She tried to ask more. The words came slow, like water breaking through a frozen creek. "Why did you stay?" He didn't answer that either. Not right away. Instead, he leaned forward, stoked the fire with a carved stick, then reached into his coat pocket and handed her something small. A bundle of dried berries, tied in twine. She stared at it. "For me?" He nodded. She took it with hands that remembered being struck for taking less. Chewed slowly. Sweetness filled her mouth, unexpected. A single tear slid from the corner of her eye. He didn't mention it. That night, they sat close to the hearth, her head against the log wall, his back to the door like a silent guard. The child within her kicked once, then settled. She rested her hand over her belly, then looked at him. "Do you have children?" He shook his head. "A wife?" His eyes didn't move, but something in his shoulder spoke. "Had. Once." She didn't press. That was enough. There was a story in the way he folded his hands, in the way he stirred the pot counterclockwise, in the way he always checked the door before closing his eyes. He did not speak her language fluently, but she began to learn his. The language of boiling water, of firewood laid just so, of shoes placed beside the bed, toe to toe, like a quiet promise to come back. And she offered her own. She began sweeping, slowly, at first pausing to catch her breath. She stitched an old tear in the curtain, set the table, 2 mismatched plates, 2 tin cups, and a folded cloth napkin she'd found buried in a drawer. When she laughed, soft, breathy, surprised, it came from deep in her ribs. He looked up at the sound like it startled him. She smiled into her bowl. "I forgot I could do that." He didn't respond, but his eyes softened just a little. On the 3rd day, she asked if he would show her how to brew the herbs. He nodded and gathered what he had. She followed his motions, clumsy but eager. Crushed leaves with the back of a spoon. Poured snow water from the pot with both hands wrapped around the handle. When the mixture turned fragrant, he grunted softly. Approval, she hoped. When she offered him the cup, he accepted it with both hands. Drank slowly. And for a moment, something passed between them. Something small, barely a whisper. A peace treaty signed in steam and stillness. As dusk fell, she sat by the window and watched the sky turn the color of old paper. The mountains in the distance looked like folded cloth under a gray quilt. He sat beside her, without speaking. They both listened to the creak of the walls, the hush of falling snow, the faint shifting of the unborn child waiting for the world to make sense. When she spoke again, it wasn't to him. "Not exactly. I think I was ready to die in that bed." The fire popped. He didn't move. "I didn't even think it was cruel. Just expected. Like I had been given what I deserved." He turned to her. There was no pity in his face. Only a stillness carved from stone and thunder. "You didn't." She met his gaze. Held it. Felt her throat tighten. And when she nodded, slowly, he nodded too. No vows were spoken. No romance bloomed like spring overnight. But that night, when she slept, her body curled around the child, her hand drifted slightly in sleep and touched the hem of his coat. He did not move away, and in the dark, beneath a roof no longer broken, they dreamed side by side, not of what had been taken, but of something still possible. The water in the kettle whispered, and for the first time it sounded like hope. The snow thinned as days passed, as if winter had decided it had made its point. The land softened. A trickle of meltwater ran beneath the drifts, unseen, but heard if you listened close. The cabin, long forgotten by men in mercy, began to breathe again, warmth curling in its corners, scent of firewood and healing tea clinging to the air like incense. She had started to walk, slowly, hand on the wall, steps unsure. But she moved. Each day, she made it a little farther, from the bed to the hearth, from the hearth to the table. Once to the doorway, where she stood wrapped in a borrowed blanket and stared at the white-spread world beyond the threshold. He stood not far off, chopping wood with clean, silent movements. When he noticed her watching, he didn't speak, just nodded once and returned to his rhythm. She watched him often now. He moved like someone raised by trees, by storms, by silence. His strength wasn't loud. It was in how he lifted things gently, how he never rushed, how he never asked for thanks. There were no expectations between them, no names called across the room, Just shared space, shared glances, shared gestures that stitched together something soft between their quiet lives. She began talking again, not all at once, but little stories, pieces of her woven into soup-making and table-setting. "I used to sing," she said one morning, stirring a pot of beans. "Not for people, just for the baby, when I thought no one was listening." He didn't ask why she stopped, but she saw it in his eyes. He already knew. She didn't ask about his past. She felt it in the way he never turned his back to open doorways, the way he walked the perimeter of the cabin before nightfall, the way he carved small tokens and buried them beneath the porch, without ceremony. They were both carrying things they didn't name. But in the cabin, those things grew quieter. Some days she laughed. Once, when he knocked over a pot, the crash sent birds flying from the roof. He looked so startled. She couldn't help but laugh until tears warmed her cheeks. He just blinked, then cracked the faintest smile. She held that smile like a gift. One evening, she offered to braid his hair. He hesitated only a moment before sitting on the floor, back to her, legs crossed. Her hands, though slow, moved with care, separating strands, weaving them like she was making prayer ropes. Her fingers brushed beads already woven in, each one a story she didn't dare ask. She tied the final braid with a bit of thread. He turned, gave a single nod, and went to the fire. Later, he left a carved hairpin beside her bowl. A bird etched into bone. Small, elegant. The days folded inward. She sewed. He hunted. She cleaned the old baby clothes left in a trunk. He tanned hide in the shed. They spoke in gestures more often than words. But those gestures were fluent. The soft passing of a cup. The shared burden of silence. The glance that meant rest now, or I see you, or simply stay. One night, a thunderstorm rolled in, wild and sudden. Lightning split the sky like something tearing. She sat upright, chest heaving. Old panic stirred beneath her skin. Not of weather, but of what it reminded her, being dragged through night roads, abandoned in dark rooms. He lit the lamp, sat beside her. She didn't speak. He didn't touch her. But his presence, still, grounding, kept her from unraveling. The storm passed. The baby didn't come during the storm. It waited. It waited until the sun returned and painted the snowfield gold. That morning, she bent to pick up a pot and winced, breath hitching in her chest. A warmth, sudden and sharp, bloomed low in her belly. She froze. He was at her side before she could speak. Her hand found his wrist. Now, that was all she said. He nodded once and began to prepare. No panic, no scrambling, just movement born of memory and deep understanding. He boiled water, laid out cloth, lit both lanterns, and opened the shutters to let in light. She leaned against the cot, knees weak, the world shifting beneath her like ocean swells. She didn't scream. She moaned deep and low, from somewhere that had waited too long to be heard. He knelt beside her. She reached for him, just his forearm, just enough to know she wasn't alone. Hours passed. Pain bent her, shaped her, remade her. He guided without words. Cool cloths, gentle pressure. A bowl of water lifted to her lips between contractions. When the moment came, he caught the child like catching dawn, softly, reverently. A cry filled the room. Hi. New. He wrapped the child in a fur shawl. She opened her arms without asking. And when he placed the baby on her chest, something inside her broke open, not with pain, but with awe. She wept. He sat nearby, elbows on knees, head bowed, not in prayer, but in reverence. Neither spoke. The fire crackled. The storm had passed. The world had become something else entirely. She rocked her baby slowly, and when she looked at the warrior again, he met her gaze without flinching. She reached out, took his hand, not in romance, not in asking, just in thanks, in trust, in the deep, wordless knowing of those who've walked through fire and found someone still standing beside them. He didn't pull away, and in the hush that followed, she whispered the baby's name, not one she'd chosen long ago, but one that had come in that moment. It meant new root in his tongue. He bowed his head once more, and outside, spring whispered beneath the snow. The world had turned again. The snow had melted into the soil, and green pushed up stubborn through the thaw. Birds had returned, not loudly, but like the land had given them quiet permission. The house no longer groaned like a dying thing. It breathed now, held warmth, held life. She sat by the open window, her newborn curled against her chest, the cradle beside them lined with fur and stitched cloth. Her fingers gently traced circles on the child's back. She no longer looked like someone forgotten. She looked like someone reclaimed. The Cheyenne warrior stood out near the tree line, his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the horizon the way hunters read wind. Something in the air felt wrong. He turned toward the house without speaking. She looked up. "What is it?" His jaw set. He stepped inside, took down the bough he had kept above the door like an old habit that hoped not to be needed. From the trail beyond the valley, dust rose. Hoofbeats followed, the kind that didn't wander. They aimed. She tightened her hold on the baby. The warrior placed a hand on the doorframe, then on her shoulder. It wasn't fear in his face. It was resolve, quiet and rooted. "Stay here." She didn't argue, but neither did she cower. Outside, the sound grew clearer. 4 horses. 3 men. 1 riderless, trailing rope. When they crested the ridge, she saw them for what they were: ranch hands in fine coats, boots too clean, mouths twisted with purpose. The kind of men who never lifted what they couldn't own. The same ones who'd left her to die. The lead rider spat in the snow. "Well, I'll be." She lived. His voice was oil over rust. Another chuckled, his fingers resting on the butt of his revolver. "You're trespassing," said the warrior. The leader smirked. "No. That girl inside is the property of Mr. Elwood's household. She ran off. There's a child now, and that's a scandal we can't afford. We've come to take her back." He didn't blink. She didn't run. She was thrown out like garbage. "You gonna step aside, red man?" The warrior didn't move. Behind him, the fire crackled in the hearth. The baby stirred. The woman's breath stayed steady. "You'll leave," he said, voice low as embers. The second rider laughed. "Or what?" The arrow landed before the words finished, lodged in the snow between hooves, precise and deliberate. The horses reared. The men pulled reins, faces flashing to alarm. She watched from the window, her heart drumming not in fear, but in awe, not just of the man outside, but of herself, still standing, still present, still whole. "We don't want trouble," one muttered. "Then why did you bring it?" The warrior stepped forward once. The movement was calm, unhurried. But the air changed. Another man reached for his pistol. Too slow. The warrior had drawn another arrow, aimed it not at the man, but at the revolver's edge. It clattered into the snow. The leader's voice shook. "We were paid. That money bought silence, not justice." The third man turned his horse. "Let's go. She ain't worth dying for." The leader cursed, kicked at snow, and yanked his horse's reins hard. But the fear had already set. They weren't facing a servant girl anymore. They weren't facing a house ready to fold. They were facing a man with nothing to prove and nothing to lose. They rode off. No shots fired. No blood spilled. Just shame in the snow behind them. He stood still a moment longer, then lowered the bow. Inside, the baby cooed. She exhaled slow. When he entered the house again, he didn't speak. She stood, cradling the child. "They came for me." He nodded. "But I'm still here." Another nod. She stepped closer. "And you stayed." He looked at her, not with surprise, not with longing, just with the quiet certainty of someone who had made his choice long ago. She placed the baby in his arms. His breath hitched, just a little, like something inside him had cracked open. He looked down at the child, then back at her. "I was supposed to die alone," she said softly. His hand cradled the baby's back. "Then someone lied to you." They stood like that as the sun dipped behind the pines, casting long shadows across the porch, across the path, across the world that had tried so hard to forget her. But she hadn't been forgotten. She had been found. And the man who found her didn't come with words or promises. He came with boiling water, with mended doorways, with silence that said you matter without speaking at all. Outside, the dust settled. The snow melted. The land went on. But in the little cabin at the edge of nowhere, something had changed forever. She no longer waited to be claimed. She was already home. And the warrior, standing at her side, didn't rescue her. He witnessed her. He stayed. And staying, sometimes, is the bravest kind of saving.